All right, so today we're here talking about school choice and particularly reasons for school choice with Jason Bedrick. Jason is a policy analyst with the Cato Institute and their Center for Educational Freedom. So the Cato Institute is roughly a free market think tank that kind of advocates for smaller government, individual liberty, choice, things like that. He actually previously served as a legislator in the New Hampshire House of Representatives, and he has a master's in public policy where he focused on education policy in particular and school choice policy. So thank you, Jason, for joining us, and we're excited to hear some stuff about pro-school choice arguments.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Great. So the first question to start off, I'm curious how you got into the issue of school choice. So how did you decide that this was an issue that was important enough for you to kind of, devote time to and attention to?
Well, education was always something that was very important in my family, but it was really in college. I went to college to study business and found out I was much more interested in public policy. I was doing a paper in one of my classes on education policy, and that's where I learned about the ideas of school choice, and they really appealed to me. I personally had a great education. I was fortunate enough that my parents could afford to live in a community that had a great public school, and then where I went for 8 years, and then I spent 4 years at a private high school, and I was also, again, very fortunate my parents could afford that, and it just didn't seem fair to me that some students had those opportunities that I did and others didn't, and so eventually I decided to dedicate my life to expanding educational options for everybody.
Great, great. So if you were to list, the 3 or 4 top reasons that you favor school choice policies, because there's a lot of critics, obviously, of school choice. So, what would those 3 or 4 reasons be? Reasons why we should move to a system of school choice rather than a system of state-run public education?
Right. So first, I don't think there's any one school that can best meet the needs of all the students who just happen to live nearby. Those schools tend to focus on the median student or the average student, and they may. I mean, the public schools again worked very well for me, and probably for most of the students that are in my class. But there are some students that just need something different, or for whatever reason, a particular school isn't working for a student. Maybe the student is far ahead of her peers. Maybe she's behind, maybe ahead in some subjects, behind in others. There may be bullying issues that the school is not able or willing to address, all sorts of things like that. So that's one reason I would like to have multiple options. Second, the market just does a better job of providing multiple options. When you have a system that is controlled by politics, political decisions create winners and losers. 51% of the population get to decide how that school is going to look.
I should actually pause here to clarify for students. Just the typical view is that schools can kind of decide kind of for themselves. So if one school wants to adopt this textbook, another school wants to adopt another textbook, or one school wants to change a curriculum this way, that schools can do that individually, and it's really a district-wide system. The smallest unit for schools is the district. So if the district wants to do this and 1 or 2 schools want to do that, they're in that district, the district really has to do the same thing.
Right, and so if you go to the Cato Institute's website, there's something called the Public Schooling Battle Map, which just shows all across the country where there are communities that are in conflict over whatever it is that their public schools are doing or not doing. But when you have a market, these different groups get to each have their preferences met. So the market actually reduces conflict, allows people to get the education that they want for their kids in a much more efficient manner than the public schooling system.
So the idea, if you were to kind of make an analogy to another area where we use the market, let's say you're buying a car. If we do it the way public schools do it now, you would get together with everyone in your district and you would vote on which car everyone should have, which means the majority get to kind of dictate what car everyone will have. Whereas in a market, the idea is if you want a Ford sedan and this other person wants a BMW and the other person wants an SUV, you'll all be able to choose those different options.
Right, so some people are going to choose a religious school, others are going to want a secular school. Some are going to want a school that's focused on you know, a liberal arts education. Others are going to want what they call STEM, science, technology, engineering, and math type of education. You're going to have all sorts of different options that are available. Others are going to want a more progressive, like Montessori, Waldorf, student-led type of education. So everybody can have their preferences met rather than the majority deciding for everybody else what they're going to do.
Right. I guess that might also offer an interesting kind of alternative to the idea of standardized testing, where everyone kind of is subject to the same testing regime. Because I would imagine that schools individually may have tests that they prefer to give, but it would be unlikely that all schools in a market system would decide on the same regime of testing. So if a parent didn't like the testing regime at this particular school, they could go to another school that either has a different testing regime or maybe no testing regime at all.
Right, actually, but for those who don't know, Common Core is this nationwide initiative to get everybody essentially on the same test or the same two tests. There's actually two testing consortiums right now, but it's a common set of standards. And there's all sorts of misinformation on both sides of the debate. My objection has always been not to the core, but to the common. There are a lot of curriculum experts whom I greatly admire and respect on both sides of the debate. And that alone says to me that we should have different types of accountability systems. Different schools can choose which type of tests that they're going to use, and parents can decide which sort of system they want their kids in.
Great. So it sounds like there's some really good reasons for school choice, but as we know, there's a lot of people who are very against the idea of school choice, whether it be the existence of charter schools as an alternative or vouchers as an alternative, something like that. So who are the groups in your experience who oppose school choice the most, and what are their arguments? And then kind of how would you respond to those groups?
I mean, really, it's anybody who is really tied or has a stake in the status quo, right? So you think of Uber is a disruptive new technology, a new service that's opening in a number of different places. And so Uber allows people to hail a car wherever they are through an app, pay through the app. They can see a rating. So it's a much better quality service than the existing taxi cab monopoly. Now, no one taxi cab company has a monopoly, but you have to buy a medallion. It's a very highly regulated industry. Those people who have purchased a medallion, which is the right to pick up customers off of the street, those are usually very expensive. They're participating in a highly regulated system. They have a stake in that system because once they're in it, it's keeping competitors out. Likewise with the school choice system, it's providing a whole bunch of new options. So, I mean, people talk a lot about the teachers' unions being an obstacle to school choice. It's not just the teachers' unions. It's the Superintendents Association, and anytime there's a bill before a legislature, you're going to see them show up. And it's also, in some cases, suburban parents that have, they have the money to afford an expensive home in a good district that has, a good school. They're paying a tax premium for that, and the idea that you're going to all of a sudden provide other options, which would challenge the hegemony of that school, it can be threatening to them as well.
So what about people who object, not because they have a financial interest, let's say, but just kind of idealistically to the private school system? So I hear a lot of people talking about how they don't think it's quite moral that schooling is offered in a for-profit system. The idea is school is a sort of a public good or a common good, if you will, and if you kind of have it as a financial transaction where I pay you to educate me, it's kind of devalues the idea of education in a way.
Right. So, I mean, first, on this idea of profit, there's plenty of profit to go around in the public school system. The teachers are getting paid, the principals are getting paid, everybody in the staff is getting paid to be there. These aren't volunteers. The people who are making the textbooks are making a profit. The people who built the school made a profit. The people who built the desks, who made the supplies, everybody is making a profit in this system. So I think it's really just people that are opposed to this idea of profit. First, I think they don't recognize what's going on in the public school system, how much profit is there. But two, at the end of the day, profit is a sign that you are creating value for people. And when you talk to people that are trying to start nonprofit schools or even charter schools for that matter, they have a hard time raising money. They have a hard time getting the capital to create this this new school that they're trying to build. That's where profit comes in. That's where capitalism comes in, where you've got people who have money that are willing to invest. They're willing to risk their funds on the proposition that this school is going to provide enough value to other people that they are going to want to part with their hard-earned money to send their kids to this school.
Right.
But in terms of some of the other arguments that you hear, you'll hear, for example, on the NEA website, they say, well, we should just have a good public school for every child in every district. That's great in theory, but we can't compare one policy to an ideal policy. You have to compare different policies to actually real implemented policies. So we've had a public school system for a few hundred years. We've seen in, let's say, the last 50 years, we've more than tripled the amount that we're spending per pupil after adjusting for inflation, and yet test scores are absolutely flat. So the idea that we're going to have great public schools everywhere, it's just not a reality. And money is not the issue either. You often hear, well, if we only fund the public schools well enough, then we're going to have great public schools. That's not the case. Washington, D.C. has the worst public schools in the nation. They also spend $30,000 per pupil. And study after study has found no correlation between school performance and additional resources. You have some states that spend high and have high performance, but you also have some states that have high performance and they have much lower spending, and vice versa, high spending with low performance, which is the worst position that you want.
One of the other objections that I hear quite a bit for school choice is, and we've talked about this in class, is a lot of people have kind of an idea that part of school's function is to provide us with kind of a common, not a common curriculum per se, but that we're all on the same page, that we're all, so E.D. Hirsch is an educational theorist who talks about schools need to make Americans. The idea of school is to make Americans. So if we allow these people to choose this school and these people to choose this school, some choose this religious school, some people choose a secular school, that we're not really going to have an America that's educated in common.
Yeah, so actually this idea of making Americans, Patrick Wolf from the University of Arkansas had a study a few years ago called Civics Exam, where it was actually a meta-analysis of a number of different studies of which types of schools are actually producing students that have higher degrees of civic knowledge, that are more likely to participate in civics events, or for those who are old enough to vote, which groups are more politically tolerant. And the overwhelming conclusion of the meta-analysis was that studies showed that private schools outperform public schools at doing that. If you want a free society, you should have an education system that respects and reflects that freedom, and that includes the freedom to be different. And so if we're going to, rather than force everybody into one system, respect the right and the freedom of people to have their own schools and their own choices, that sort of system says, we really are a diverse, pluralistic society. You respect my right to educate my kids my way, I'm going to respect your right to educate your kids your way, as opposed to the public school conflict where we put everybody into one system and majority rules, and you create a system of winners and losers.
So now that we've talked about school choice and kind of the pros and the arguments that have been made against it and the responses, what are some of the most exciting areas in terms of where school choice is happening? And are there any legal controversies in different places right now that are kind of particularly interesting?
Right. So 2011 was the year that the Wall Street Journal called the year of school choice, because there was about a dozen new or expanded school choice programs that year. I think this year is on track to be the year of educational choice, because one, there's about a dozen states that are looking at scholarship tax credit programs. There's, I think, one that's looking at vouchers. And then there's about another dozen states that are looking at education savings accounts. So again, I call it educational choice because you can choose a lot more than just a school. Already, there are 3 states where the at least one body of the legislature has adopted education savings accounts. So in Virginia, in Colorado, and in Mississippi. Actually 4, I believe also Oklahoma. So there are 4 states that are on track to pass an education savings account program. And again, there's only 2 states right now that have it. That's Arizona and Florida. Both states have bills to expand their education savings accounts programs. So I think this could be a very big year, and we'll see what happens. There's a lot of opportunities for research to see how these programs are implemented, and I'd like to see that going forward. In terms of, I think you mentioned lawsuits also?
Yeah, because I know that there's been, several lawsuits over the decades, starting with, I think it was Cleveland, Ohio, in the 1990s, I believe, and then some others where there was, the typical challenge of school choice programs. One of them is that it violates the First Amendment's separation of church and state, because some of the schools are religious, so you end up spending public money essentially on religious schools.
The first idea, in Zellman v. Simmons-Harris, in I think it was 2002, the United States Supreme Court ruled that voucher programs are completely constitutional and are consistent with the First Amendment, because they have a secular purpose, which is to educate students, and the only entanglement with religion is through the choice of the family, right? So nobody is forced to go to a Catholic school. The only way a child ends up at the Catholic school is if their parents choose to send them there, and that's really no different than, let's say, somebody who receives, SNAP, which is like the food stamps benefit. They could purchase, a food for their Passover Seder, or they could use their Medicare at a Catholic hospital that has a crucifix in every single room and has a priest on staff, or they could have their Section 8 housing, and at their apartment every week they could have a Bible study. Now, in each of those cases, to some extent, there's a subsidy for religious practice. But in each of those cases, there is a primary secular purpose that's being funded, and the only way that anybody gets involved with religion is through their own personal choices. Even though the federal government, or the U.S. Supreme Court has ruled that under the U.S. Constitution there's no church and state issue, at the state level there's something called the Blaine Amendment, which most states have. About 40 states have a Blaine Amendment. Now, a little background. In the late 1800s, early 1900s, there was the Know Nothing movement, which was a nativist, anti-Catholic movement. In those days, all public schools were de facto Protestant schools, non-denominational Protestant. So they would teach the Bible, but they would teach it in a manner that any Episcopalian or Congregationalist or Baptist could get behind, but not Catholics, and to some extent also not Lutherans. And so Catholics, and to, again, a smaller extent Lutherans, opened up their own schools, and they said, hey, we, through our tax dollars, are funding your Protestant schools. We would like we'd like the state and the local communities to also fund our Catholic schools. Fair's fair. But the Protestants, the Protestant majority, turned around and said, oh, no. These are non-denominational schools. Yours are parochial schools. And so if you want to have a parochial school, that's your right, but don't expect us to fund it. So again, most states, even though there's a senator from Maine named James Blaine who tried to pass an amendment to the U.S. Constitution, it failed, but most states adopted this that says public funds cannot go to religious schools or at least they said parochial over time that has turned to mean religious in general, not just essentially what it meant was Catholic at the time. So some voucher laws have survived challenges under Blaine amendments, where the court says, we're going to interpret this just no different than the First Amendment and the way that the Supreme Court, the U.S. Supreme Court, has interpreted the First Amendment. A few states have struck down the voucher laws under a Blaine amendment. There is no state that has, no state Supreme Court has overturned a scholarship tax credit program under a Blaine amendment. The other challenge in Florida is something called the uniformity clause, which is to say that the Constitution in Florida, like several other states, not only enables but demands that the state provide a system of public schools, and those public schools must be free and uniform and high quality and a number of other things. The question is, what does uniform actually mean? So can they have? Does that mean they can't have charter schools? What about special ed? Students that have all sorts of special needs, whether it's from ADD all the way to cerebral palsy or Down syndrome. Can we not have schools for them? Are they sort of exempt from uniform? Does uniform mean uniform curriculum? Does it mean uniform funding? Does it mean we're not really sure what it means. So that's actually going before the court, where they're saying, well, uniform means that the school has to be public. It can't be private. We'll see if the court buys into that notion. I find it unlikely.
So I guess the uniform clause doesn't disallow private schools, but it means that there needs to be a public system, at least as it's interpreted now, in place in order for anything to be fair.
So the lawyers for the defense are saying whatever it is that uniform means, uniform doesn't mean exclusive. So in other words, the state must provide the system of uniform schools. That doesn't mean it can't also do other things and provide other types of schools.
Right. All right. Well, this is all really interesting stuff. I look forward to following some of these events, and I hope that our students are kind of starting to think about the pros and the cons of school choice programs, and this is a great addition to our research on that subject. So, Jason, I thank you very much for your time.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.